Hello, I'm here with Joy Grafton, who's a member of our church and also a licensed clinical social worker with over 10 years of experience in our area, counseling children, teens, and families and others through all kinds of things. And she is such a wealth of information. She actually also has a practice here in town called Restore Counseling and Consulting. And she and her husband, Tom, also direct our college ministry, which has been really awesome for them to be in that role. And I'm so thrilled that she's willing to once again help us out when we need to call a counselor for something. And as you know, we are doing a parenting series right now called Raise Them Up. And we did a survey of anybody who would be willing to take it of parents in our congregation. We had about 70 parents actually go through the process of taking the survey, and one of the main questions that I wanted to focus on that I asked parents is, what is it that you are struggling with most? And so we just gave them the opportunity just to fill in the blank of whatever they felt like they were struggling with. And then I went through a process in survey research called Coding the Data, and kind of started figuring out what is it, kind of, if you categorize these responses, what are the things that people are struggling with? And the number one thing that came up in our survey that I wanted to start out talking to you about was the issue of discipline. And it actually surprised me a little bit. There's some other things that we'll talk about later that I thought would have been higher on the list, but obviously when discipline is a problem, it is a struggle. Sure. And so I was really surprised by that. And I was just wondering, does that surprise you?
No, not really. When you think about parents and discipline, we often don't want to be seen as the bad guy, right? So it's really hard to be consistent. And so I hear this a lot, like a lot of parents struggle with discipline because I think part of our mentality is that it has to be punitive, like it has to be a punishment. But when we think about discipline and we go back to the root word, it's Latin. I may say this wrong, and my husband will correct me for sure. It's discipulus, which actually means student. And the theory actually that discipline should be more like a teaching, not necessarily punitive. And so when we kind of take it that approach, I think it's easier for us then to be consistent and clear, right? And we want it to be not like an authoritative teaching, but more of like a connection and a respectful teaching. And so it changes the feeling of discipline, right? But when we think of it as punitive, no parent wants to be the bad guy, right?
Yeah. I know a lot of times the focus ends up being very much on should you spank or not, and that becomes like the total thing. And you'll have a grandparent or somebody tell you, well, that's the one thing you need to do if you were just spanking them more or whatever. And I love the fact that word helps us get to the root of what that really means, that you're coming alongside and you're actually leading them.
It actually means disciple.
Yeah.
Like discipline means disciple, which is a student, right, to teach.
That's right. So you're discipling them in discipline. And that's why people who don't want to do discipline, well, that means you don't want to do discipling, which of course, those here at Christ United, we want to make disciples.
That's right.
Several of the responses that are in this category that I pulled out, one of them is they were talking about setting appropriate boundaries and keeping them, that one parent said. And then the other one was the line between being too punitive and following through with setting boundaries.
Sure.
What would you say to parents that are struggling with setting boundaries?
Yeah, I think it's important to go back to your why. So if we're thinking about being a teacher and we think about the most influential teachers in our life, they had a passion and a reason why they were teaching, right? So as a parent, we want to have a why. What is our why for being a parent? What do we want to teach our kids? What lifelong lessons do we want to instill in them so that they can be mature, healthy, functional adults? And so when we think about like how do we have consistency in our discipline and our parenting, we got to know our why. And that helps create our boundaries. That helps like us make decisions about, what is the consequence? What do we really want to teach them, right? What do we want to, what is a yes, what's a no? And then we can make all kinds of decisions based on that. And it's not as confusing, and it's not, if we understand our why, then we can make our own decisions and kind of tune out some of the noise around us.
Yeah. And I'm a parent of now, I'm a parent of kids who are starting to leave the nest. I have one who has left the nest for a couple of years, another one that's just about to, and by the time people see this, he will have left. And you feel like, you're like, okay, there you go. They're out in the world, and you really, the main part of your influence, not that you don't continue to parent them, you don't continue to coach them, hopefully you have a great relationship, it changes, but much of that value transmission has happened by then. And I've been very, with our oldest son, it's been really neat to see the way that he's living out a lot of the values.
Yeah.
I mean, I see him living out the values that we hoped to instill in him. And it's by the grace of God, because I don't, we tried our best always, but it's the grace of God that helps us with that.
Yeah.
Another facet of this had to do with parents' self-perception as a disciplinarian, and also comparing themselves to other parents. And I think we look around and say, what are other parents doing, and why should I do that? Should I not do that? And so I'm just kind of wondering, what would you say parents who are struggling with that comparison?
Well, again, I think that goes back to you as a family unit establishing what's important and the values that you want to have in your family. And when you know that and you're secure in that, sometimes what other people are doing doesn't make as much of an influence. But we live in a very noisy world, is what I call it. Like, we have a lot of influential things around us, whether that be, even us parents are on social media, whether that be social media, whether that be other parents around us, or our parents in our ears, we still have parents, some of us, right? So we've got to really kind of come to terms with, as a family, our family unit, what's important. Then my next encouragement is then find like-minded families, find a community that supports you in what you believe. And then it's not as hard, to do it, right? You're not comparing to everybody that's outside your circle. Right, you have a great network and a support within.
Yeah, one of the things I love about our church are all of the life groups. There are a lot of life groups that have parents, and they're supporting each other, raising their kids together. And several of them meet on Sunday afternoons, and I've gotten to be in some of those spaces, and it's so fun to see them. And it really, it's kind of, they all sort of help parent all the kids. There's a shared there, but if you got shared values, that makes that so much more, so much easier. One parent wrote that they struggled finding that happy medium between being the disciplinarian and the fun parent. And especially if you've got another spouse and you're the fun parent, and they're not, one's the bad guy, the good cop, bad cop sort of thing. Another wrote, sticking to what I feel is best for my kids, even though it's not the norm for other families, also having them miss out on things due to discipline, but they need to learn those life lessons sooner rather than later. And so I would, kind of getting back to that thing about being the disciplinarian versus the fun parent, and almost like the perception of your kids of you. I mean, like, what would you say to a parent struggling with that?
Again, our role as parents is not to be their friend. And often that's where kind of that desire comes in, of that fun parent and wanting to be the parent that is not the disciplinarian. But kids thrive on structure. They thrive on expectations. They thrive on consequences. I mean, one of the best lessons in life are natural consequences. And so if you're consistent with that, then you start to gain respect, and your child knows what to expect from you. So that kind of builds trust, right? So I think sometimes the shift changes in our child's mind of like, I can trust mom or dad, right? Where we kind of internalize it as, oh, I'm the bad parent. But I think it builds a level of trust when we're consistent and we communicate and we have that respect, and we're like not afraid of discipline. When I say to teach, doesn't mean that there's no consequence. We have consequences, but they're appropriate, and they are giving instruction to our child of how to live in the future. So then it makes sense after time, right? Like, it's not going to be just punishment. Punishment like lasts for a minute and it doesn't really teach us anything, right? So that's why it's hard, right? And we feel bad, the kid feels bad. But if we're looking at it as, what are we teaching our kid? Then it's easier to kind of wrap our mind around, like, this is for a purpose, not just discipline. Right.
Just discipline for discipline's sake, but discipline for really discipling them, and consequences, allowing either natural consequences or, if you have, hey, if you do this, this is what happens, this is the consequence, and then letting that. And I know sometimes, I think about in my parents raising me, sometimes the consequences that I suffered also made them suffer. So like, I can't tell these stories until Ella is 18, but I was grounded for like 4 months one time. And that meant my parents were grounded for 4 months because they couldn't just trust me to be there by myself, because they literally couldn't trust me. And I think that's one of the hardest things, is that to stick out, to kind of stick to what you say you're going to do, it's going to cost you something. But when you start thinking about it in terms of discipline and discipling, in the sense of the discipleship part of that, it seems like it's a lot more worth it.
Yes. And it is hard work, but you're looking towards your end result. Right.
Yeah, that's right. Two other comments about this challenge, and there was a couple of comments just people said, and I thought these people had some really great advice, and I'll read both of the comments and you can just comment on them. But one of them, and I thought this is great advice, staying quiet and listening versus immediately offering advice or instruction. And then another one said just letting them fail. And that's but these are things that they know they're supposed to be doing these things, but they're struggling with those. What would you say to that?
It is very hard. And again, going back to the teaching modality, when we want to sometimes interject, it's because we want to protect our children and save our children, which is a natural response, right? These are our babies and we love them, or these are our nieces or nephews or our,
grandchildren.
Yes. But it's okay to fail. That's how we often learn through life, is through failure. And what's important is how we pick ourselves up and how do we keep going and how do we learn from either mistakes or how do we learn from challenges. The Olympics are going on and that's just so inspiring, is watching people who are so dedicated, but we can instill the same modality in our children with everyday life. And so my suggestion is to stay curious, listen. Kids are pretty smart, and we know that. They can figure anything out on technology that we can't, but they sometimes can. They have, God gave us these amazing things as brains, and they can learn to use them and problem solve. And they just sometimes need us to hold their hand and support them and love them, versus come in and preach at them, or because sometimes that feels like judgment and shame, which actually shuts down a child's ability to kind of work through problems, because then they're feeling, I'm just going to be punished, right? Versus I'm supported and I have somebody believing in me, right? What if we actually praised their character more than their accomplishments in life? That would build some of that decision making. And so stay curious, get involved with what your children are, and then listen. We will learn a lot. We call it attunement too, is the more we become attuned to ourselves or our children, we'll start picking up on things, needs that they have, behavior changes. And then we can start saying they maybe need this, right? Versus trying to question and then, well, when I was a child, I did this. Well, times are different. I hate to say it, it's not the same as when we were kids.
One of the things that came up in the surveys, and so we also had a survey for teens, and thanks to our youth ministers forcing them to do it, we got a bunch of responses recently. And what was interesting, one of the things that parents wanted, I think the question was, what would you want your kids to know about you and how what you're struggling with? And a lot of the parents, lots of them, I would say probably 10 or 15 of the 70 responses said something along the lines of, I've been where you've been, I've been there before. And there is this sense, and of course anyone who's a parent has been 15 before, they've been 12 before, they've been 18 before, but being 18 30 years ago for me, 32 years ago for me, is different than being 18 today. And there's some that's the same. Well, what was interesting to me, that was fascinating, but what was even more interesting is that the kids sort of communicated, and theirs not quite to the same number, but many of them said, my parents don't know what it's like to do what I'm doing, which I think all kids have always felt that way about their parents. And so I think there's a little bit of truth on both sides of that yes, we have been there before. There are many things about being 18, 12, 11, 5, 4, whatever age your child is. Some of that we don't remember, and so as parents we're learning, I don't remember what a 3-year-old does because I don't remember being 3. But that we really are struggling because we think we know. And yes, we know some of that, but we don't know all of it because it's a different world that our students and even our young children are living in.
Yeah. And there is insight from wisdom, from life learned, experiences, but we also have to be mindful that it's going to be a little different, and just with, our world is a little bit different. The values of the world around us are different. And so I think being curious and listening, we will actually learn a lot that will help us then know how to guide and steer our children into the values that we hold as a family.
Something that, I'm going off script here now, but something that Joy did for us recently, which is so helpful for our student ministry, kids ministry, is she and some others as well that she called in, some reinforcements to come help her, did some trauma, we call it trauma training. And it's something that the church is learning about. One of the things I was really fascinated, just as an aside here, is that Tim Tebow's Night to Shine event has an app. There's a whole module on trauma training in the Tim Tebow Night to Shine app, which is was fascinating to me because I was kind of coming into the more and more knowledge about this topic. But one of the things you said in that training, I got to sit in on some of it, was that behavior is communication. And you may touch on that later in our interview. Feel free to do that. But maybe just say what that, because I think that helped me, especially when it comes to like discipline. I'm thinking about like when I was, I've used this in sermons before. I can remember one time yelling at David when he was 2 for not eating his peas, you know. And I had a moment where I was able to kind of get outside of myself and look at what I was doing and going, I'm yelling at a 2-year-old about peas. I mean, this is not quite effective. As critical. Right. Well, no, it certainly wasn't effective, but you know, whether or not your 2-year-old eats 3 more peas, though we want them to. And thankfully, I was able to kind of step back and see how ridiculous what I was doing is. But I did a lot of ridiculous things over the years, especially in those areas, because you're learning how to do it. You get frustrated. You're carrying frustrations from your life for your work and things like that. And then your kids are just being kids. Often they're not necessarily being intentionally. I've said, you know, I don't think 3-year-olds are bad, but they are 3-year-olds, and man, it feels bad. So kind of just say that, because I thought that was a revelation to me for you to say that behavior is communication.
So, you know, as a therapist, we believe that all behavior is a form of communication, and also sometimes an example of an unmet need. And so when we look at like a child, especially a small child, I have 4 children. I have a 13, 11, 7, and 5. And when we look at their behaviors, a lot of times they're communicating something they need. And so they just don't always have the words that you and I have, and often I don't have them either as an adult, to say this is what I need, because that takes reflection, that takes, you know, us to kind of breathe and think about it. And so children react very quickly. And so often we see that as a temper tantrum, or we see that as defiance. And so we get all riled up and we start having behaviors. And so we're actually going to have one of the parenting classes. Okay, so one of the parenting classes is going to be on co-regulation, led by another therapist friend of mine. And that's really the whole consensus of her talk, is that we need to be regulated in order to help our children regulate. Because if we come at them with high emotion, right, behavior is a form of communication, and we're mad, right, what are we communicating? Mad, right, and punishment, and what are we teaching, right? We're teaching our children sometimes to react out of their big emotions versus, like you said, let me get outside of myself, let me regulate, and say, what is the need here, right? And sometimes the need may be nourishment, so I need them to eat a few more bites, but then you adapt, how do I teach that? How do I communicate that, right? Versus like force it. Because what are we, like, they're not gonna wanna eat peas ever again, right? Like, I was forced to eat this. So we have to really look at even our own behavior as communication. And in the moment of discipline, where are we coming from? Are we coming from anger? Are we coming from our own hurt, right? Or are we in matching our child's hurt or need? Or are we coming with understanding and respect and listening? And what do we want to teach them, right? Because emotions are part of who we are. That is what makes us human in a lot of ways. And so it's okay to have them. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be mad. It's okay. And that's what we want to teach, right? Healthy ways to regulate our emotions. And discipline to me is a great way. Like, I'm not always right, and I think it's harder when they're younger. My husband and I were just talking about this last night.
And it's much easier to talk about it than to actually do it. To me.
And when they can't talk to you, and it's just all the, you know, we get lost in that. And so it's just, how do we calm down and say what's important here?
And I think it's like easier, like with a baby. Because you have very low expectations of what a baby. You don't necessarily attach moral meaning to a baby crying or something like that, and we pretty much know that they're probably tired, or they're hungry, or they're uncomfortable with a dirty diaper or something like that, and or some other thing is just not quite right, what they typically appreciate. And I honestly, I honestly don't think that changes even now. If I'm hungry or tired or uncomfortable,
you get cranky.
I'm cranky, and now as you mature, hopefully you can regulate better, things like that. But I remember a couple of years ago, we did a thing on anxiety, and Carrie Watley, who's also a therapist who grew up in our church, she used Elijah's example of when he's running from the prophets of Baal, and he's running for his life, and God ends up giving him a snack and getting him to take a nap. And she said, that still works,
yes,
a snack and a nap. And I think oftentimes our kids, especially when I think about the little ones, when we're attaching some sort of moral meaning to their behavior, they're bad. They're probably not bad. They're probably hungry, or they're tired, or that. And I think if we can take a moment to reflect and go, okay, what are they trying to tell me? What are they communicating with that behavior? It just it's amazing, what a difference that can make. And it may take just a couple, as a parent, it may take a few moments to just take a deep breath and go, okay. Kind of almost you put on your, investigator hat, your Sherlock Holmes hat, and your start investigating what's really going on here.
And that's where attunement comes in. The more we're curious and get to know our children and learn their behaviors, we become attuned to hey, this is different, something's happening. But you also mentioned we've got to check our expectations, because as a parent, we often expect our children to pull it together, right? And to be in line and to know. But we as adults struggle sometimes, just like you were saying, we have moments of humanity, we're human. And so what if we took those moments with our children and said, hey, this is a good example of what I'm trying to teach you, right? Remember when you had this fit, this is what I'm trying to teach you, is that in these moments, I want you to think about but we also have to take in consideration their age. And you said, little kids aren't bad. I don't think any child at any age is bad. I think they're a product of kind of their situation sometimes, what's happened to them, what's going on. And we think about brain development, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But science is a beautiful thing, and it's come out to tell us that the prefrontal cortex of our brain, which is where we reason, decision making, isn't fully developed until we're in our mid-20s. And so when we have these expectations that our teens or our young adults are going to just know right from wrong all the time, or have it all together, their brain isn't fully even functioning at some of the reason that we are as older adults, right? And then you look at their environmental situation. And so I think checking our expectation also helps us with sometimes this desire for our kids to be perfect, right? Or have it all together.
And I think it once again goes back to your kind of early word that we get focused on punishment rather than discipline and discipling, teaching. And I think when you know that, there are right and wrong choices. There are things you can do that are right, and there are things that you're doing wrong, and students and children can make poor choices, but the reasons for those poor choices, it's helped to understand maybe why that's happening, what they're communicating, why they're doing that. And then as a parent coming alongside that, and I think about when I referenced earlier being grounded, well, during that 4 months, yes, my parents were grounded, but they needed to be grounded because I was a third child, and third children get away with anything because the parents were moving on and doing other things. And that 4 months, which I'd actually been grounded for 2 months previously and got let off for good behavior after 1 month, which they shouldn't have done because I was just faking it. But to that 4 months, we connected as mom, dad, son, probably more than we ever had. And it ended up being a life-giving thing and a wonderful, and our relationship grew so much because of that. So, but it meant we had to slow down and they had to pay more attention to what I was doing and why I was doing it. And I had to reflect in my own life what I really want, because my life was clearly, I could start to see I had two directions that I could go. It was very clear to me. And if I keep going down this direction, I could kind of see where it was leading. And there might be a lot of fun to be had in that direction, but a lot of difficulty. And then the other direction is the direction I took, which I think eventually led me into, led me to my faith, led me into ministry, all this. So, but don't be afraid, kids shouldn't be afraid you might end up in ministry.
And I think that's a great point for discipline, is sometimes there are short-term, struggles for lifelong lessons, right? So that punishment was a short-term inconvenience, right? But you learn lifelong lessons from it.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, the root of discipline, right? What do we want to teach them, for the lifelong?
Yeah, that's good. Well, the second thing that came up on our survey, the second kind of most popular answer, if you will, or most mentioned struggle, I categorized as a struggle to protect our children. And really there were two different kinds of comments in this. One of them was kind of in general protecting them, just making sure they're safe and okay and things like that, maybe protecting them from outside influences and like that. But a huge part of this had to do with protecting them because of the internet and social media and all the world that's out there, that there's so many things you don't want your kids to see and do on the internet, and people you don't want them to interact with. And interestingly, and I don't know if I shared this with you before, but the students, that only one student out of 50 that did the survey mentioned anything to do with technology or social media as something that they saw as a problem, which I think in some ways that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
And it doesn't surprise me that parents are worried about it. And the reason why parents are worried about it is because the kids aren't worried about it.
Right.
One student wrote, I probably spend too much time gaming, online gaming and things like that, which, and my sons and I, we talk about this, and online gaming is very social, very communal, because they're playing with their friends and things like that. But it is good to get out every once in a while too. But I know that was the one thing that one of our students felt like they recognized that was a difficulty. So I think with protecting them, I just like one of the comments, I think it sums up what they said. He said, trying to raise them up in the right world with so many bad influences. That's kind of the world around us is, there's a lot of bad stuff in the world that we don't want to be influence our kids. And then more specifically, they did mention the challenge of technology. What do you think the best practices are when it comes to this tricky world of technology, social media, and how to handle all that?
Sure. And this is, again, to me, it really goes back to the family values that y'all have. And so establishing very clear expectations, very clear boundaries and rules, and explaining the why. Parents are sometimes afraid to really explain the why behind the reason, right? And so communicate with your children. We can educate them about what's out there in a non-threatening way. I know there's this whole movement of fear-based parenting that came about in the 80s and 90s, rightfully, because what was happening in our world, about that time. But so it really instilled a lot of fear-based, we have to protect them. We're the only people to protect our children. But again, that goes back to, if you have a community of like-minded parents or like-minded just community around you, then we can learn to have trust in other people, but we are educating them on the reasons why. Why do we as a family don't agree with social media until you're a certain age, right? Part of it is brain development. Kids are very influenced by peers and what they see on TV and on TikTok and the gram, or Insta. We heard it called the gram. I know, we heard it called the gram the other day.
And now Insta. I think it's now Insta, yeah.
But can't keep up. But anyways, so we want to be their first teachers, right? We want to be their educators. We want to be their truth tellers. That's what I tell my girls. I am your truth teller to explain the reasons why. And that's about all hard conversations, including social media, how their brain isn't developed, right? So if we're giving them this full access and they can't reason, right? They can't always deduct what is safe and unsafe, right? And so I need to be the protector in that sense of educating them of why that's important, that I protect them in that, right? And so it's communicating, stay curious, and monitor. We cannot give kids free access, period. That's me as a parent and me as a person. That's one of my values, is that we need to be involved in our children's lives, and we need to know what's going on so we can help educate them and protect them and make sure they're around like-minded friends.
I think I may be getting wrong about who said this, because I think a number of people that I've read have said this, that we've become in some ways an overly protective society, and so that, and I'm referencing a podcast I heard years ago, that there was a time when they did a study of kids and how far they'd ever traveled from their home without supervision. And when I was a kid, and my parents didn't know how far I went, but I would ride my bike when I was 11, 12 years old. I'd ride my bike 5 or 6 miles away from our house
Sure.
by myself without anybody knowing where I was. And that terrifies me because I would never let my kids do that, especially in Mobile. I was grew up in a smaller town. But nowadays, and they went back and did the same kind of study in the same town. And they found that most kids had not gone more than a block from their home unaccompanied by an adult. And he later on went on to say that they also did an analysis of crime and the things that we're afraid of, like being kidnapped and stuff like that. Of course, I grew up when everybody started putting kids on milk cartons and things like that, part of the fear of that. And that basically in that community, crime was 400 or 500 times less today than it was in the 70s, late 70s when that study was originally done. But this researcher, I think it's Jonathan Haidt, I can't remember.
The anxious generation.
Yeah, the anxious generation. He says that, I think one of his ideas or arguments is that we probably need to loosen a little bit, give them more independence in the real world, but because the problem is we have almost opened the door completely in social media and things like that. And so kids can go anywhere and everywhere and see everything on the internet. And we've not done a great job of protect that, where maybe the greater danger lies. And then we've instead kind of locked them down. And part of why there is I think it's fair to say that anxiety is a much bigger problem now than it probably has been in the past. I don't know if that's because we're identifying it more or if we're just better at naming it or whatever. I mean, it probably you could argue either way. That I don't think we talked a lot about anxiety as a kid, and I'm sure I had some. But I think that was really helpful to think about that. And so maybe just kind of, you sound like you're familiar with some of that.
And, there's lots of theories of thought regarding pros and cons of this specific topic. But I do agree that, that fear-based parenting that I mentioned is what you were talking about in the 80s and 90s. We became more aware. Like, things have been happening since the beginning of time, right? Like, if we read through the Bible, there is all kinds of hard things and bad things happening to people. And so it's not new, but we just started becoming more aware of it. And as technology really took off, we became really aware. And so that fear, and I'm a social worker, so I am very particular about where my kids go and what they do, and without me or somebody I trust with them. And so I get it, right? I get it. And we do need to be mindful because there are bad things that happen.
And oftentimes it's the places where you kind of let your guard down.
Right. But I think if we also teach skills and we teach our children, how to be mindful about what's around them and, how to trust people, like the appropriate people, how to communicate if something feels off, if they feel scared, then we can let go a little bit. But I do agree that we have almost pushed the bad things inside. And that's kind of where that book is going, The Anxious Generation, because we're not monitoring what our kids are looking at, and the exposure rate is getting younger and younger for things that kids just don't need to be seeing and watching. And then, like, how people are preying on kids is much different. They're luring them in, through what they are into, so electronics, right? And then the kid doesn't have the reason to say, I can't trust this person, right? This person is saying that they're my friend, or this person is being honest. And so then bad things start happening again out in the public when they meet up, and so we've got to have a balance. It's not that I think fear is healthy to some degree, but we don't want to live and act in fear, right? The Bible doesn't call us to walk in fear, it calls us to walk in faith and trust in God, right? And bad things still happen, but we are able to use, like, our brains as adults and parents to say, this is what I want to teach and educate my children on, right? These are the values that we have, and we don't have to live in fear, but we can be mindful, right? We can be aware. And so this is a very, like, popular but also controversial movement right now, this anxious generation. But there's a lot that I think is truthful, when we look at just again, it goes back to our reaction as a parent. How are we making this decision, right? Is it just our fear, our pride, our ego, right, coming out in what we're teaching our kids? Or are we looking at it from a well-rounded view, saying what is important to teach my kid about the future? Yeah. Right.
Something that, it kind of goes back to your idea about discipline and teaching kids. And I have to credit my wife, Crystal, for this, but we have our kids have watched TV, you know, probably way too much for some parents. You know, I'm always always admire the parents who are like, we don't even have a TV in our house. But we would, you know, walk in the room and there'd be a show on, and nothing awful, nothing horrible, but there's certain things that some values that we had. And one of them that I think is interesting, there's some of these Disney shows and all, and some of them don't have a parent in the show. The kids are sort of taken care of, they're dealing with it though, and often the parents are sort of denigrated.
Yeah.
And one of our values was, we're not going to watch a show that denigrates parents and authority figures and things like that. And that was something my wife picked up on. And so as we talked about what they were watching and what would be good to watch and maybe not good to watch and why, we got to where we would walk in the room and we would not say, turn that off, you can't watch that. But we would ask our kids, do you think that's appropriate? And the kids would go, and they would change it. They wouldn't argue or anything like that. They would just, and we would invite them into that analysis. And if they thought it was appropriate, we would have a conversation about why it might not be appropriate. And then, of course, if it got down to where we thought it was inappropriate, they thought, you know, we were right. So, but we tried to involve them in that. And I'll have to credit like my wife, Crystal. I think I would have been more of a turn off, go to your room, that sort of thing. And instead, they learned, because obviously your kids will not always have you. And of course, as they've aged, they're able to understand more, and we often will watch those shows together and we'll talk about those things. But eventually they will be making those decisions on their own, and they'll be deciding what's appropriate and inappropriate and yeah, sometimes they're going to make decisions I would not want them to make. That's completely understandable, because they will be 18 one day and starting to be on their own. But I really like to think about it, and I think that might be helpful. And I was really grateful, because when Instagram was coming out, our son David was, I think, 11 or 12, and his friends were getting it, and he said, "Can I get Instagram?" And we're like, well, we'll talk about it, you know. So we look in the App Store at the time. You had to be 13 to have Instagram, and of course you could lie about that. That's what all the kids were doing. And I'm like, well, I mean, it says here you got to be at least 13. So when you turn 13, we'll talk about it again. Well, he never brought it back up until he was 17, was when he first got on social media. And he did that because he got a job and needed to be on Facebook to drop shifts and things like that. And our son, who's about to go to college, he got a little bit earlier than our oldest son did. And I think might have done that without our full and complete knowledge, but still, you know, he was probably 16 by the time he was on that. And then our daughter, who's 14, is not on any of those social media platforms. Now she texts her friends and things like that. But anyway, someone had given me advice that we should let them on and kind of help them learn how to use it and kind of coach them through it. But part of it is you're not going to be with them all the time. And so I'm personally, this is for me, you know, obviously everybody's going to make their own decision, but I think one of the best decisions we ever made was delaying social media until later in life. And yes, our kids think we're strict, I mean, all those kind of things, you know, and that's okay.
And I think that goes back to the values of a family, right? So y'all make a decision as a family of what's appropriate. And some parents do younger, which is okay if it meets their values, and they can monitor and they have those conversations, you know, but like I don't personally have the time to monitor all four of my children's social medias, right? So we're not going to do it, right? Because I know my limits, right? And I know, not that I don't trust my children, but also my job is to know what I can do and how I can teach them, right? But some parents can, and that's okay. But I think you've got to make a decision as a family, what fits the values that you're wanting to instill, right? And we don't have to be like everybody else.
That's right.
And our kids feel that so much pressure anyways. Yeah. Every time they are walking the halls at their school, or every time they're on social media, they feel like they have to be like everybody else. And if we set the example, hey, you don't, and it's okay. Yeah,
and I don't.
Right?
Then my mom used to say, Rob, I'm not everybody else's mother.
Yeah, right.
It's good. It's a good line. You can quote Gibbs Couch on that one. Yeah. So in our survey, we asked parents and students, what's the right age that they thought to have a cell phone? And also what's the right age to get on social media. And what I found was, for the most part, kids and parents generally agree on these things, and they all felt like getting a smartphone in the middle-aged time was okay, both parents and students. That was kind of the most people kind of fell in the category that middle school. Some felt like high school was better on the parent side. The majority of students felt like middle school was that. But when it came to social media, the parents were pretty strong about waiting until high school for social media, any kind of Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, whatever the newest one is. There'll be a new one today.
Yeah.
But the kids did feel like middle school would be fine to start that. So I could tell that was where there was some separation in terms of the attitudes.
Right.
Between parents and students. And of course, that's going to create some conflict because parents have one attitude and kids have another and all that. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about age? And I know, I mean, again, I know it's everybody to their own, but and you've kind of said what y'all are doing. But
so professionally and personally, I feel like high school is more appropriate just because of brain development and what kids are able to, handle, really. So that's professionally and personally kind of what I feel. Now, going back to the pressure, everybody has one. Well, okay. So it's also about compromise, and each child's different. And this is really hard, I think, too, with discipline and parenting, is when you have different children, like even though you may have had them all or you're raising them all the same, you're going to have different personalities and you're going to have different needs. And so how do we kind of make adjustments and attune to what's going on? So like I caved personally with when my oldest got a cell phone, but it was for practicality, right? We don't have landlines anymore.
Yeah.
And so
there's
no payphones. And so, for as a safety, I wanted to be able, not that she would be with anybody I didn't know, but I wanted to be able to get her if I needed her, or if she was watching my youngest one, right? I needed some kind of communication for her. But we can get creative. If you're against cell phones, there's flip phones. You don't have to have a smartphone. We can do things through the iPad and you can call FaceTime. I mean, again, it's being creative and thinking outside the box, but also meeting the need of your family.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something, those parents of younger children who haven't gotten here yet, it's time to start thinking about that, because I think it's only going to be even harder.
Yes.
Now, one thing I'm grateful for, I know in the Mobile County public school system this year, they are not allowing kids to have their phones with them. And some schools were letting that, some schools would not. But now they're either going to have to put them in the yonder pouch or they put them in a box when they come into the room and they can have them between classes. Because one of the things, and this is kind of going back to practicality, many teachers use multiple platforms to teach. And so you need Remind and you need this and you need that. And part of what we're doing in raising our kids is helping them gain more and more independence so that we're not the ones managing their homework.
Exactly.
We're not the ones telling them. And so we're like, you need to get on the Remind so that your teacher can communicate with you. But I do think I'm seeing, at least in our public schools and hopefully in others, I know the private schools, many of them had already done this, that they're starting to go, hey, maybe it's not good to have every kid have a smartphone in their pocket all the time.
Right.
And now because of the pandemic and now everyone has some sort of a Chromebook or something, and there are all these, like Schoology is the one that's being used in the public schools. There are ways to communicate with the students through Schoology. There's ways to post all the links and all the things that they need. And then the Chromebooks that they get are locked up, so they can't get to much of anything. And so it's really, I think it's better, because I do think, to a degree, teachers trying to do a better job teaching and trying to use these wonderful resources out there, especially when the smartphone was in its earlier days and becoming something that more kids had, they would go, oh, well, they need to get this app and they need to get this app. And I mean, as a parent trying to manage, you're like, I have to have 17 apps. There's Dojo and all these different things. And I'm starting to see more consolidation there. I think that, and because many of the teachers are parents, and they're going, ooh, this is hard to deal with. And so I'm grateful for that, because I think, again, it's values, it's community values, it's school values. And of course, we can influence our schools, we can influence our school systems and private schools, whatever you find yourself, because you want those places to support your values.
Right. And that goes back to a community, and that's, he talks about that in that book, The Anxious Generation. If we as a society started making the norm this, then it wouldn't be so hard to follow, right? So no phones in schools, or if developmenters of these apps would put age limits, right? If we could get society to start saying, because of research or because of science, right, little kids don't need to be exposed to this, or their brains can't develop this, so let's put an age limit on this app, right? And or schools, if the norm is that you don't have your phone in school, like maybe your Chromebook, because that's functional, the phone's a distraction, right? If we as a society started making this a norm, then we could start changing some expectations, right? Which is wonderful. I think England, like Europe and a lot of places have started adapting some of these. I know Australia does as well. And they're seeing a lot of great benefits just because of the pressure that's taken off of kids too, right? They are able to function like a student.
Nobody else can have their phone either.
Right.
Nobody, that's good. So in our survey, there were two other things that kind of rose to the top of things that parents are struggling with. And we're going to talk about both of them in this segment. One is confidence. And that's kind of, I gave that category to it because a lot of the comments were just parents feeling like, I'm trying to do the right thing, but I don't know if I'm doing it right. And the other one, and this is the one I thought was going to be number one, was busyness. And I wasn't quite sure what to call this, but I did feel like some of the comments that were made, like there was concern, are they leading kids in the right direction? So there's kind of question like, what if I'm making the wrong choices? What if I'm doing that? And they're anxious because they feel like the decisions that they're making are, could ruin, I'm going to take this to maybe a hyperbolic level, could ruin them, but there's a sense of, I don't want to make the wrong decision because by making the wrong decision, I may affect their future. And I think depending on where you are in the process of parenting, you might feel that more than at other times. One parent admitted to questioning themselves and just feeling guilty, and others just struggle being consistent and with all that. So what can you say to those who are kind of struggling with confidence as a parent?
One, we will all mess up. We will all make mistakes. We are human, right? Just because we become a parent, by whatever means that is, doesn't mean we develop these all-natural superpowers that we have it all together and we know everything. So give yourself some grace. It's okay. Like when we talked about failure earlier, sometimes we will fail. And how do we pick ourselves up? And what is the life lesson? So if we lack confidence or we feel like we've made a mistake, apologize. Talk to your kids about it sometimes. Now, and it's appropriate different ways, but like we lose our temper. You're talking about losing your temper with the peas, right? Sometimes the best lesson is to come to your child and say, you know what? I really lost my temper and I'm sorry. That wasn't how I should have responded. This is what was going on. And what are we doing? We're teaching our kid, oh my gosh, when I have these big emotions, this is how I should act, right? Or it's okay to say I'm sorry, right? So again, confidence, I think, is built by the more we can learn from ourselves and learn from our experience. And we are okay, we have communications. And then it's okay to regroup, right? What if we do get off track a little bit, right? We're influenced too by what's around us. We've been talking about this book. I don't know if it's the right way or not, but like we're influenced by it. So if we try it for a while and we start seeing things that we don't like, we start seeing behaviors that we don't like, or, hey, my child's really struggling, regroup. It's okay, right? It's a learning experience for all of us, parents and children, right? There's no rule book. They say they say this, if we could ever meet those theys, right?
That's right. They know a lot.
They know a lot. But so we've got to have some sense of growth for ourselves too, right? And that also goes back to the community of like-minded parents and support. Like have people that will build you up and encourage you and pour into you and, pray with you through the hard times and say, how do we need to regroup, or how do you need to fix this? And we receive a lot of pressure as parents as well, that it's all dependent on us. But again, if we are in a like-minded community, there are other people who are instilling truths into our children and who are pouring into our children, who are going to love our children and teach our children, right? So it's not always on us, right? And our children are going to learn. They're going to be different, right? We don't have to accept all the pressure that it's all on us to make sure our child is okay.
That's right.
Right? Also, our children are God's, right? God gave us them as a gift, right? We have to also let go and trust God too, right?
And I love that. It reminds me of when children babies are baptized, and really when anybody's baptized, the congregation
Right.
makes a promise. Now, when
Exactly.
it comes to children, it's a little more focused on helping them grow up.
Mhm.
And I try to remind parents that, hey, you don't have to do this alone.
Right.
And it can be very lonely.
Yes.
But I hope they will embrace that. And even with this series, I know that not everyone who comes to our church is actively raising a child right now. Some of them may be helping to raise grandchildren, maybe nieces or nephews they're connected to. Some people really may not be around kids other than at church.
Right.
We have a responsibility to
do.
them. And every time that we baptize a baby in our church,
Yeah.
we remind ourselves of that
Exactly.
commitment. And
Right.
so it's helpful to remember that you don't have to do it all, and it's grace.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's grace.
you're going to need a lot of grace as a parent.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of regrouping. And you sometimes feel like, well, I made that decision and I went down this pathway, and I can't, because I made that decision 2 years ago, I can't change it. Like, we turned on social media 2 years ago. Now we let the, Pandora's box has
Right.
been opened. Well, I don't know about the story of Pandora's box, but we can close some of
Yeah,
these doors,
exactly.
and maybe some of the harm that was done you can't undo, but you can keep further harm from happening for whatever decision you might have made. And so that's
the
great.
beautiful thing about life is we are constantly learning and growing, right?
Mhm.
And there's grace that covers things that we get wrong.
Mhm.
And we don't have to get stuck in the past, right?
Yeah.
We can restore and we can renew and we can regroup and we can try again.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what we want to teach our kids, right? It's okay.
Mhm.
Like, not giving them permission, like go out and be a,
Right. Go
do
out
whatever.
and make a lot of mistakes
Right.
and learn from them and hope you
Right.
survive. Yeah.
Right. But if you do, I'm here to support you
Mhm.
because I'm also learning too.
Yeah. So the other thing, and I think those are great insights, the other is about busyness.
Mhm.
And I just see it in my own life. And
Yeah.
we try very hard not to be overly busy. And yet we find ourselves super busy because of the things that we've chosen to do. And like I said, I thought it would be number one because of the hectic lives that parents and kids are living. I think my favorite comment that summed this all up, a parent said, it's nonstop.
Mm-hmm.
It's nonstop. I mean,
Yeah.
it parenting, all the things our kids are involved in, all the things. And so, I mean, how do you feel like parents can deal with this challenge?
And it's a struggle. And I'm going to tell you, the more children you have, sometimes it's a bigger struggle because what you do for one, you want to do for all, and there's all your time. And so it's okay to say no. Like, I think, get so afraid to say no. And if we say no, this goes back to comparison, I think, we then have to justify it. We don't. We can say no, right? And that goes back to our family values. What do we value as a family? And if we are prioritizing family time together, I keep going back to the story of your parents grounding you for 4 months, and what you gained from that is that reconnection with your parents. And you even have the insight now as an adult to say they needed that too, right? Parents need that too. We need to be connected to our kids, right? We want to be connected to our kids, and we do that by spending time with them. But as a family, what does that time look like, right? Sports, extracurriculars are amazing. They do great things for children, but can we limit that, right? Because family time is also important. So have boundaries. Have your values, like know your why, and then make that the expectation and make it clear, explain it, right? So it's okay. Like, there's not a right or wrong. Some people love it, thrive on it, but when they're exhausted, then they have to say, this is why, right?
Yeah.
And if they're okay with that, great. But if they're not, then what do I need to change? Can we regroup? Is it maybe one sport per kid? Or there's a lot of, I mean, and it's really hard. I think there's a lot of pressure in our society today with like kids determining early what they're going to be in life, which makes some of that pressure.
Right.
But we've got to slow down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think about, now, I never want to go through another pandemic again, so don't get me wrong. But at the time, we had 3 children at home. I guess David was he's our oldest, was maybe, it's 4 years ago, he's 20, he was 16. And suddenly we were all grounded for
long time,
several months at the very most, because at first we're like, oh, can we go anywhere? What are we gonna do? And eventually we're like, I'm going somewhere anyway because I can't stand it. But for our particular family, it was sort of Shangri-La. I mean, it was so nice because we had each other, we had our little bubble, and we started playing basketball in yard, and we Bought I ordered, everybody ordered stuff from Amazon. I ordered a little, like a tennis net that we set up in our patio, and we played a little bit of tennis before we knew about pickleball. We should have done pickleball. We did all kinds of wonderful things together and spent lots of time together and really had reconnection with that. We binged a lot of TV shows and had fun doing that. Well, I think we watched every single Marvel movie in sequential order, and that was great. And I think we had other friends that were in our life group that we were Zooming with once a week, and they were experiencing that too. There was this wonderful feeling of having time to just be together. And yes, at times you could get bored, you could get restless, you could get that. And I feel like we are fully back into, if it's not busier now than even before the pandemic. And I think to some degree we've done that. We may have done that without reflecting a lot, because we're so, I'm ready to get back, I'm ready for things to be normal. And I think sometimes we feel like we have to do these things. And it's one of my favorite things to do in talking with people who are in my office seeking help is they'll say something, I have to. I'm like, whoa, who said you have to do that?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, don't I have to do that? I'm like, well, you can choose to do that, and it may be really important to do that, but you have the choice. You don't have to do that. And I think we go through a life in parenting. Sometimes we're so busy we can't even reflect on why am I doing this? What value is this bringing in? Something that we will talk about during the series, I think, is in the first sermon, which will, depending on when you watch this, you just heard it, or maybe you'll hear it later. But is one of the major, talking about values, what are your values? I think if you look at and I used to say your date book and your checkbook, but those things are not really what people have anymore.
Checkbook.
But look in your calendar app and look in your banking app, and you'll largely see where your values are, because where time is probably your most precious resource, especially with kids. You get 18 years before they move on to the next thing, and so that's a very limited amount of time. And then of course money is something that most of us feel like we could have more. We would love to have a little bit more, because we just can't quite make it, and maybe there's more month than there is money at the end of the month. And so we are, but we look at that, and if you want to know what you're really valuing, that's one of the greatest kind of dashboards, is to look at that. And that, for a parent, a lot of your time and money is spent on your kids, and so that will show you what you are teaching them to value. It's a little convicting. I kind of don't want to do it.
Yeah, and it goes back to, what are we trying to teach our children, and what life lesson do we want to instill in them? And when we talk about confidence in parenting and how do we have consistency with discipline, I think it comes through the connection we have with our children, and that comes through trust and respect. And so when we're pouring into our children in monetary things, it's great, right? Keeps them active, it gets stimulated, and it grows them. But I think we have to have balance in how much we're pouring into them, in a relationship well, because when they're in their 20s and 30s, they may remember going to baseball practice or cheer practice, but they're also going to know, I can call mom or dad because I trust them, right? They support me, they love me. And that comes through the relationship we have from them, with them. And so I think if we kind of put that into perspective too, of how do we say no, what does my kid need, right? Are their behaviors communicating to me that they need more of me, my time, my attention, right? Are they disrespectful? Are they having, tantrums all the time to get my attention? Right? So maybe I need to make some adjustments and spend more time with them, play games, read a book, watch a movie, right? That's how we build the communication when they get older, right? Is we're present, we're there, right? We do support them by showing up at games, and that's wonderful. And I love that. Kids need activity.
Yeah,
we need them outside more than inside on their phones.
That's right.
But the balance, how do we have a balance? And sometimes it's just learning to say no, because our family prioritizes this. So it could be Sunday dinner every Sunday, right? No matter where you are, we're home for Sunday dinner, right? Or Wednesday. It could be a variety of things, but it's you as a family making that decision of what the value is and why. Yeah,
to intentionally connect. I'm reminded of Susanna Wesley, who was the mother of Charles and John Wesley, who founded the Methodist movement. And I think I can't remember now, she had lots of children, but I don't think only 13 of them survived,
Yeah.
and which was very common. You would have, there was lots of infant death.
mortality,
Yeah,
yeah.
infant mortality was very high. But she spent, I want to say, an hour individually with each child every single week,
Yeah.
just sitting down with them. In addition to, she taught them, they
Yeah.
did lots of things, but she pulled them aside and spent at least an hour with them. And a lot of her focus was about their spiritual development and all that, but connecting with them. And, we see her as the mother of Methodism, and what she poured into them is what I think poured out of Methodism,
Yeah.
poured into Methodism, and it's still carrying us now. And so I think interesting that parenting was a major part of Methodism.
Yeah.
And so that why we're even here and all
That's
that.
neat.
Well, there's a lot more we could
Yeah.
probably say, but before we go and sign off on this video that we're making, which we'll show parts of during services, is there anything else you just want to tell parents before we sign off?
You're doing a great job. Keep it up.
Yeah, we need to hear that.
Yeah.
Look in the mirror sometimes.
You're doing a
and
great
say-
job. You've got this.
Yeah, that's awesome. Joy, thank you. It's
Yeah.
been a joy
It's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
to
Thanks.
visit. I think
Yeah.
it's really helpful, and Joy is around the church all the time, and you will run into her and
Yeah.
just give her a high five and tell her thank you for her insights. And you can certainly, and I think we should plug our parenting classes.
Yeah.
We have several different parenting classes. You mentioned Lindsay Gurley, who works. Y'all have a practice, kind of shared space.
We share an office
Share an
space.
office for your practices, counseling practices, and she's doing one night.
One night.
And remind me and tell us what she's doing.
It's August 14th, so the first Wednesday night, and she's doing a lesson on co-regulation, and so how that helps with discipline and consistency, and that goes back to, like, if I'm checking how I'm feeling before I parent, I can help my child regulate. And so it will be great. Y'all will learn a lot if you attend that one.
Yeah. And then my wife, Crystal, and I are doing 3 weeks starting on the 14th. And there's a book written years ago by Les and Leslie Parent called The Parent You Want to Be. And the sermon series we're doing is going to be touching on this throughout. But she and I are going to get in it, and it talks about developing 10 traits within yourself
Okay.
to be a better person, which will make you a better parent. And it's a little more focused on, less on technique and more on kind of knowing who you are and what you're bringing and developing those things within you to help you be a better parent and all that. And then you're doing something as well.
It's so fun for me. It's how to handle hard conversations with your children and age developmentally. So the first one we'll talk about kind of the preschool, elementary age, then it'll be kind of middle school, early teens, and then teens on to early adulthood. And it's addressing conversations that make us a little awkward as parents, but I think are very needed to help, again, build trust and communication with your child.
No, it's going to be really good, because what we wanted to do with Raise Them Up is we have a huge responsibility. We have lots of kids here. We have kids, if you count the kids in C Sports and Kids Crossing and the kids that come here on a regular basis, thousands of kids are looking to Christ United, and their parents and grandparents are looking to Christ United. And we feel the weight of that responsibility to raise them up. And it's my hope and prayer that everybody who's watching this and everybody who's part of this on Sunday mornings no one will say, well, it's not for me, because it's for everybody, because we're all, and not all of us are going to be disciplining a child, and some of you will be very grateful to know that that's not your job right now, but we all have a responsibility for it. And Jesus said, let the little children come unto me. And so he very powerfully exhibited our role as followers of Jesus about what we're supposed to do. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for joining us.